will be hitting record, and we'll be recording the session for others in future use later on. And with that said, I'll turn it on over to you, Arun.
All right. Thank you all for having me. I do a lot of presentations, and normally I can brag about being in sunny LA when I'm talking to people in Boston and New York, but y'all are in San Diego, which is even sunnier. So I can't flex like I normally would. But I had a chance to look at the other sessions, and it looks like there were a lot of cool ones. So I do appreciate you opting into this one, and I hope I'll make the time worthwhile. My plan is to run through this, prepared talk, but leave anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes at the end to take questions and perhaps even have a conversation if there are things that you see in a different light or have additional resources you might want to share with the other counselors. As Rich noted, I have a colleague, Jacob Cantor, who's in here. He does a lot of our connecting with folks, and I'll explain that a little bit more. But Jacob, I'll have his both of our contact information at the end. If you do want to get the PowerPoint deck itself, and you don't feel if you're kind of happy to not take notes, all good. And otherwise, with that, I hope that you can all see my PowerPoint. I'm assuming someone will, send me a message if they can't see it, but you hopefully should be able to see this slide. And again, my name is Arun Panasamy. My pronouns, he, him, his. My title is Chief Academic Officer at CollegeWise, which I'm going to explain a little bit further, just to give you a little sense of my background. I started off in the world of college admissions at my alma mater, the University of Chicago. The joke where fun goes to die, if any of you are familiar with it. I had a pretty great experience there, but I certainly recognize it's not the school for everyone. And after several years of working in admissions, helping make decisions on who's admitted, who's not, who's going to get a merit scholarship, I ended up moving on to another crazy party school, Caltech in Pasadena. And again, played a very similar role, one of the most remarkable institutions of higher learning that I've ever been at. Like twice in the cafeteria, Stephen Hawking bumped into me in his wheelchair, and it was just like, whoa, some of the just absolutely brilliant and talented students. I also spent time evaluating applications at UCLA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And for the last 16 years now, I have been with CollegeWise, and we're actually the largest education consulting company in the country, meaning families. We work directly one-on-one with families through the college admissions process. We have some tutoring services, things of that sort. And because I was formerly admissions officer, and many of my colleagues who work at CollegeWise were spread throughout the country, we're founded actually in Orange County, so right in between us. Many of us are former admissions officers. Many of us remain very close with the friendships we developed with school counselors when we were on the admissions side. A fair number are former school counselors as well. So another cool thing that I think interests at least the high school counselors in this room who are more engaged with, perhaps the college application process. We also, along with the Common Application and Michelle Obama's Reach Higher initiative, actually sponsor the now for the second year, the Excellence in College Counseling Award, where we recognize school counselors who are really focused on the college counseling aspect. This year, we actually announced the winner just 2 weeks ago. It's actually a group of counselors from Miami-Dade County, specifically Miami Palmetto Senior High School. Jeff Bezos apparently is an alum of the school, which I found fascinating. But that was a little exciting. So a little bit of just the background, the way that where I'm coming from, and so going back to the way a lot of folks think about admissions. When I started off in the world of college admissions, my mentor was kind of the resident philosopher of college admissions in a lot of ways, a man by the name of Ted O'Neill. And Ted, when I was a little bewildered being 22 and now being told you're an admissions officer at the selective university and you have to help make decisions, it was a little like, whoa, like, where do I even start? And he said, listen, this entire process is about great storytelling. And we're looking to understand individual students better. And we're going to learn about them through their story. And what I've come to learn, and I have spent so many years on that side reading, think it's around 8,000 applications, about 25,000 essays. I've heard all the stories out there to a certain extent, but I know to the larger public or people who haven't been on the admissions side, so much of the admissions process feels like the story is told through two particular things. The report cards, the courses a student takes, the grades they receive in them, and of course, standardized tests. And that seems to be what so much of the anxiety, at least around the world of admissions, focuses on, is like, well, that's what the application is entirely about. And I think that's been heightened to an extent, particularly with many schools going test optional. I was speaking with our executive director of college counseling at CollegeWise this morning, and we were both talking about the fact that we almost, as a admissions culture or a college counseling culture, we're almost having to deprogram ourselves from thinking about testing in the way that we might have in the past. We know that because of the pandemic, a lot of schools have gone test optional, which then raises the question, if the SAT is not being looked at, if the ACT isn't being looked at, if subject tests are no longer going to be offered, well, how will colleges possibly make a decision on me? And the truth is, this is where the social emotional components come up. I think there's also been this question as to, how are decisions, made? And that's heightened some of the anxiety and the stress for students when you know that, privilege can play a huge factor into the way that students might navigate this entire process. There are some students whose families have the ability to hire an education consultant from a company like CollegeWise. There are some students who are savvy enough and have broadband internet, which allows them to access, our free resources. There are students who have, get to go to public or private high schools that have really healthy school counselor to student ratios, and others who might not. And so that privilege is also something that I think has really affected the way as colleges recognize it. They have to kind of look at and speak to the ways in which they evaluate students. And it can't go without saying that the events of last summer, the murder of George Floyd and the aftermath, the calls for social justice, admissions officers are real people. And as are the school counselors, the college counselors that work with these students. And there was a recognition, like, we have to, further center this process in the lived experiences of students. And so that brings me to this idea of social emotional learning. And one of the ways, the way that I like to speak about it in relation to admissions is by talking, kind of framing it through the lens of, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning organization based out of Chicago. And, they've created this, kind of SEL wheel here. And as I mentioned, I'll make sure we have, or if you want, you can even message Jacob in the chat if you would like to get this PowerPoint. He'll happily just drop your email address in there, and he'll make sure that you get it. Or Jacob, you could drop your email address in there and folks know to email you. It has the URL, so you'll have a chance to dig in much deeper, because obviously this is something I can talk about anything for hours, but this in particular is something I care a lot about. And so I could talk about it at length, but we have a limited amount of time. So you've got this wheel here kind of highlighting 5 different things, which I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into. But before I get into that, I do want to highlight that the personal characteristics of students have always been a part of the admissions process. So right here, I'm talking to a group of counselors. This is what a counselor recommendation, any school that's part of the Common App, it asks the counselor to write, a letter of evaluation and highlight the personal characteristics. And same thing happens with the teacher evaluations, where the teachers are asked to speak to the personal characteristics. So already baked right into the DNA of the process, it's not just about the tests or the GPA. There are a lot of factors being considered by these colleges and universities. A term that we, on the admission side, we call it holistic admissions, where we're looking at a multitude of factors to make decisions. Now, I will note, because I'm speaking to a California-based crowd, the CSU process is less holistic than the UC process. The University of California process has essays. There is a section that where you speak to the activities that you're involved with, awards and achievements that you may have won. Some schools, Berkeley in particular, University of California, Santa Barbara, has a special program, College of Creative Studies. Letters of recommendation become a factor. The Cal States are less holistic in the sense that they are contextualizing things in terms of which school you're going to and what percentage of students might be college going and things of that sort, but they aren't necessarily looking in a more nuanced way like that the UCs might. So I do want to kind of introduce that when I talk about most colleges being holistic. The CSUs definitely are more focused on which courses you took, what grades you received, how that aligns with the kind of major, what you'd like to major in if you're thinking about a CSU. So to an extent, what I'm talking about here would be the UCs and, a lot of the publics in other states and certainly virtually all private universities. And so continuing on, this is taking, this is a snapshot of the teacher evaluation within the Common Application. And I like sharing this with parents and students, particularly the ones who are really wound up about like, my kid needs to take another AP course if they're going to get into, Berkeley or get into USC, or, they need, they need these perfect test scores. And they're not surprised to see things like academic achievement being something that a teacher is expected to speak to. They're often very surprised to see that a teacher is being asked to, attest to the things in the bottom half of this grid: integrity, reaction to setbacks, concern for others, self-confidence, initiative, independence. And, it's worth noting, not every student has all of these things. And the good thing is we've got over 2,000 four-year universities in the country. And it's only a certain percentage, a small group, that are really looking for students whose check boxes are in that far, off to the far right, the excellent, outstanding, one of the top few I've encountered, right? That does tend to be the more selective universities, though. Like I do want to note that, the more selective a university is, the greater the expectation that all the check boxes are off there to the right, that these are students who are showing integrity and maturity and things of that nature. And so again, to contextualize this further, when we talk about when so many students and parents think about the process being about just GPA and test scores, this is taking a look at the last, we use that phrase unprecedented quite a bit these days. This is probably the last precedented year of admissions, 2019. And what you're seeing is a grouping of very selective universities, many Ivy Leagues, MIT. Stanford, you'll see there's no bar there because they choose not to share their data because they feel like it's so anxiety provoking and used out of context. But what you're seeing is that orange bar is showing how many applications these schools are receiving. So in Cornell's case, the highest bar, over 50,000, close to 60,000 that particular year. The tiny blue slivers is how many these schools are admitting, right? These are amongst the most selective schools in the country. And you are seeing that they are absolutely admitting just a fraction of the students who are applying. And that can be, some students' families will see this and kind of make them think, well, my kid's got to double down and get even better test scores, or take more APs and get even more perfect grades. And I want to highlight the fact that sometimes what gets lost, students can live in their little bubble. I don't know San Diego particularly well, but I have had the opportunity to speak in, the La Jolla community, San Marcos. And I certainly have gotten the sense that those are two particular communities that absolutely are like somewhat insular bubbles, right? They're wonderful communities, but it could come very easy to forget about what the rest of the city looks like, the rest of the county looks like, let alone the rest of Southern California, the West Coast, so on and so forth. And this is one way of illustrating that these schools have to rely on so more than just like numerical understanding of students. We'll meet these students who will tell us as a college counselor, like, I'm number one in my class. That's got to be a big deal, right? And yeah, absolutely. You're number one in your class. That's an amazing accomplishment. But in the larger applicant pools, it's worth noting we have nearly 34,000 high schools within the United States alone. 34,000 high schools, which means that 34,000 high school kids each year can say, I'm number one in my class. Another 34,000 can say I'm number 2. So we're now up to 80,000 kids who can say I'm number 1 or 2 in my class. How amazing is that? I'm clearly one of the best students in the country. Well, but you are, but that doesn't get you any step closer to the most selective of universities. And I've done a little bit of a snapshot here at the bottom with some very, very particular group of schools, where you can see every Ivy League school put together has 14,536 spots. But I've already identified the fact that there is over twice that many kids each year who can say, I'm number 1, right? And, 4 times that if we talk about, numbers 1 and 2. So even a kid who said, well, I'm in the top 10% of my class, I don't know why you're telling me that Berkeley is going to be a reach for me. Well, these applicant pools are massive. And they have, again, as they look to make decisions, they have to move just past things like, oh, you're number 1 in your class, or, oh, you were class president, or, oh, you were captain of the football team. And so another way to illustrate it is, just looking at test scores, the ACT, looking at in 2018, you can see a 36 is a perfect test score. Astonishing. But even that year, about 2,800 kids scored that. And again, I showed you in this slide before, the entering class at Harvard is only 1,650. If Harvard said our only admissions standard is getting a perfect on the ACT, they would still end up in a world where 1,000 plus kids, they wouldn't have a spot for those kids, right? And you throw in you throw in a 35 on the ACT, and now you're up to over 15,000 kids who are getting a 35 or 36, which is a really high score. And that's more than even all the Ivy League, freshman seats that are available. And so we constantly have to, in this effort to kind of bring down the anxiety and remind kids what the admissions process is really about, we constantly have to remind them of often what it's not about. And that's not to be entirely obsessed. Do good grades matter? Will they help, will strong test scores help get a scholarship or admission? Yes, they certainly don't hurt, but they're not the only thing. And so I want to start highlighting like what these colleges are actually looking for as we talk about these social emotional components. I'm also going to stop and get a sip of water. And, this is taking a look at MIT, right? The renowned STEM, institution. And a lot of students, again, they think about, I'd love to go to an amazing engineering school like MIT, which means I've got to take APs and all the sciences, blah, blah, blah. But at no point does MIT say we're looking for students who have a 5 on AP physics. We're looking for students who have a 5 on calculus BC. What they're saying is they're looking for things like risk-taking. They're looking for creativity. They're looking for, excitement, kids who like love this stuff. And this can often be a little jarring to some students when they actually sit with it, or the parents who are like, well, we think we're doing all the right things. Like we're signing the kid up for like this research opportunity and he's doing this internship, and, they're programming their lives to within an inch of their, to every single minute. But that's actually not what a school like MIT is looking for. Digging in, looking at a school like Harvard, Harvard is talking about they're looking for like a sense of humor. They're looking for energy, concern for others, which I'm going to talk more about at length. And again, here, they're not talking about looking for a perfect SAT. And this goes on and on. This is Swarthmore, one of the most select, Philadelphia area liberal arts college, and they're looking for things like civic engagement. So again, the narrative around what colleges look for in admissions is a lot broader than the one that the vast majority of students and parents tend to embrace. And the colleges do their part to kind of speak to that, name it, but it's not always necessarily heard. And, even like USC, a school I think a lot of us would be familiar with here in Southern California, so many kids get fixated on this idea of wanting to go to USC because, oh, the football team, or it's a gorgeous campus, or it has some level of prestige to it. But look at what they're talking about. They're looking for students who are willing to venture outside their comfort zones, interested in the world, in other peoples and cultures, examining important issues from a global perspective. This can be jarring to that kid who's just thought about going to USC because, oh, it's famous. And, like my uncle went there, my grandfather went there. And like, no, USC is like, we want students who will speak up in a class to make others think or fight for a cause, right? And so these colleges, certainly it's a little idealistic. I think we know that there are certainly kids who get in who don't embrace all these things. but it certainly speaks to what, at least the front lines of the admissions process look like. And so I want to highlight the fact this is also very data driven. Some of you may be members, those of you on the high school end, you may be members of NACAC, National Association for College Admissions Counseling, organization all of us at CollegeWise belong to. And when they did a survey last year looking at how does positive character attributes, what role does it play in the admissions process, you can see the more selective a school is. If you look at this, by selectivity, you look at 42.3%. If a school admits 50% of the applicants or fewer, 42.3% consider positive character attributes considerably of considerable importance. The less selective a school is, the less important it is. What's not seen here is if we started breaking this 50% down into schools that admit 25% or fewer of the applicants or 10% fewer of the applicants, you would see that considerable importance ratchet up to probably 80% and then up to 95%, right? So the more selective a school is, or the more a merit scholarship might be desirable, healthy social emotional components become a huge part of it. So I need to back it up just for a moment and just kind of, remind folks there are real people. As a former admissions officer, this is a scene from, I don't know if you ever saw Admissions. It was kind of a bad Tina Fey movie, her and Paul Rudd, of course, falling in love somewhere along the way. She plays a Princeton admissions officer, but I like this picture because it really shows there are real people who are part of this process, right? Even at UCLA, which I think, last year, I think this year they're at like 140,000 applications, but last year they were at 121,000 applications. All the applications, all those essays, all those stories being told in the application are being read by real, live, trained human beings. There aren't any sort of cutoffs. There aren't any sort of algorithms that are weeding them out in the holistic admissions process. There are real people reading them. So I would read these applications, think as an admissions officer, thinking about, gosh, what would he have been like on my soccer team or in my fraternity? What would she have been like as part of the Habitat for Humanity spring break trip or in my biology class? Like, you're reading these applications at a really personal level. And as you're reviewing these applications, also important to understand, we're constantly keeping our eye out for like evidence of things like passion and curiosity. And it's not just the, I have done it, right? Like, I have taken AP English. The more selective a school is, the greater the desire to understand the why behind it and how you went through it. Because I think all of you are familiar with those students who, yes, they get an A in a class, but they've also gotten the A in the class, not necessarily by embracing the material or embracing curiosity, but by asking for extra credit after every assignment that the teacher offers. And then that there's that kid who got a B in the same class, but you know what? Math is pretty hard for that kid. And that student actually takes time to speak to the teacher once a week and does the extra homework to get better at the course. On the college end of things, we're pretty excited about that kid who just works really hard, even if it's not something that comes to them naturally. And that gets a lot to the why behind the grades and things of that sort. So as I noted before, I wanted to speak to, Castle, Collaborative for Academic, Social, Emotional Learning. I'm a big fan of their work, and I would encourage you to kind of like check out they have a lot of great resources and exercises some of you may enjoy doing with your students. But highlighting this wheel, I want to kind of link it directly to the admissions process from the admissions side, also being like a college counselor, the ways in which it manifests itself. So I'm going to start with self-awareness here. And this idea of self-awareness, I'll share a story. And again, not a knock on La Jolla, but I remember being an admissions officer at Caltech. And we had a lot of remarkable students. I think when I was there, the admit rate was about 13%. I think now it's down to like 8% or something. So we had remarkably talented students applying, of which nearly 90% we would have to turn down. Almost everyone had strong grades, strong test scores. We had to really dig in and get a better sense of like who's really going to thrive on this campus, who's really going to impact us in a positive, healthy way. And I remember there being a young woman from Torrey Pines High School. This is years ago, so no way anyone will be able to invite her or remember who she is. But Torrey Pines, and I remember, you get to the personal statement, the essays later in the application. So I was very impressed by her grades, her test scores, how the rigor of her program, activities, accomplishments. I now get to her like, oh, this girl's a serious candidate. I now get to her essays. And in her essays, I still remember this. She talks about developing this love of physics by she lived in a house right by the beach and she could hear the water, the ocean waves rolling in, and how the rolling in of waves, and she related it to physics. And I was like, oh, what a cool introduction. The waves there relate to, waves in physics. Oh, this is great. But then her essay takes this turn where she starts talking about, but things are really terrible right now, basically, because my dad's informed us that my dad recently told us we're moving from this home and this is terrible. This is what I know as my childhood, blah, blah, blah. And just starts mourning this house. And you're a little like, okay, this is weird. You're applying to very selective universities. And she's just talking about having to leave the beach. Admissions officers don't get paid enough to get, weepy over something like that. Right. And you're just a little like, ah. And then she resolves the entire story by saying, but it's okay, because it turns out our new house is going to be right on a golf course and we're going to have our own personal private pool. And you're just kind of like, that's a lack of self-awareness, right? When there are kids who want to come to Caltech and they're writing essays like, my parents moved here as immigrants from Vietnam. I have a chance to go back every 2 years. The water infrastructure there is so poor. I would like to become an engineer so I could go back and contribute to better health standards. And this girl has taken her personal statement to talk about like, life sucks because I have to leave the beach, but now it's good because we're gonna have a private pool. That's a lack of self-awareness, obviously an extreme version of it, but it is something where in the admissions process, we're looking for, all of you probably had a chance to kind of read through the text here, this idea of growth mindset. Those kids who get grades just for the sake of getting grades, very different. The kids, there are those kids who are like, oh, I struggle with English, but like, I'm still going to show up every day, do my best. I know I can get just a little bit better, versus the ones who just shrug it off like, I can never be good at it. I'm a total math science guy, blah, 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 right? It was always remarkable to me at Caltech, where 90% of our students had taken, if AP English was offered at their school, even though these were math science, computer, whizzes, they still took computer science and AP government and things of that sort, because they kind of recognize like, it's just important for me to be able to grow. And of course, this idea of identifying emotions. I think all of us, counseling side, you're working with kids who are increasingly anxious, stressed. Those kids who can actually identify their own emotions and name them and then be able to engage with them are often so much more successful, not just in the admissions process, but in high school as well as through college. And again, I will speak to a little bit more about that as towards the end. This idea of self-management, that managing stress, which I just talked about, but the motivation of oneself. I think one of the most striking things, gosh, now 10 months ago when the pandemic really kicked in and kids moved to like hybrid learning, or fully online learning, I really got an inside look at my students who honestly were just genuinely motivated versus the ones who, once the structure of showing up every day and getting assignments and having mom and dad perhaps check on them about getting X, Y, and Z done, once left to kind of, hey, figure this out, as the teachers were figuring it out, as the principals were figuring it out, and the students were asked, some of my students become completely, they didn't know why they were doing the things that they were doing. They were working off just like check boxes in life. Those kids who have some sense of how to motivate themselves, like they've set goals and that becomes the driving force, they fare really well in this process. They fare really well in life again, right? So I'm framing all of this in terms of college admissions, but probably those of us who are adults are like, yeah, like I kind of know people who have stress, who know how to manage their stress and have self-motivation. You just kind of go a little bit further, or certainly if you don't go further, you go through life with a lot less stress and a little bit more ease. And again, these students, we have to remind parents sometimes, the parents, again, without knowing, didn't do the usual thing of asking which high schools you were all from, and probably given the number of people here, it would have taken too much time. But some of you have those parents who are still setting alarm for their kid and waking them up every morning. What happens in college when mom isn't there or dad isn't there to knock on the door and make sure that the kid hops in the shower, and mom and dad aren't there to make breakfast and get the kid like nourished and off to school? These are things colleges care about. So we're constantly emphasizing that with our students. And certainly on the admission side, we're always looking for evidence of that. And listen, I get it. Not all students have all of these things, but that certainly, again, for the kids aiming for merit scholarships, the kids aiming for more selective universities, each and every one of these pieces becomes a little bit more important. Social awareness. I spoke a little bit earlier when I referred to the girl at, Torrey Pines, and followed by the Vietnamese boy in the next application. But I talked about George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, right? The kid who I've spoken with admissions officers who talk about sitting in an interview with a student and kind of going like, in a non-political way, what thoughts do you have about like, what does Black Lives Matter look like in your community? And if there's a kid who says like, well, there are no Black students at my high school, so it's not really something I think about, that's a lack of social awareness, right? That's kind of a kid who's not kind of recognizing what the larger world looks like. That's a student who doesn't fully understand the idea of being like a good citizen, being a larger part of the social fabric of America and things of that sort. And so you've got these students who kind of are like, well, I volunteer every week at a homeless shelter, right? I put in I get 15 hours a month, right? Well, okay. I mean, that's a form of social awareness, but that's not really like digging in. And so, I'm often talking to kids about like, you're not just, you don't do community service like for other people, you do it with other people, right? And that can tend to be more impactful. And colleges, I'll point this out later, but they are able to dig in on this. It becomes part of the interview process, as I noted, but it also becomes part of the essay process. And so this idea of social awareness, it doesn't mean that you need to be like, fists raised in the streets all of last summer, but there has to be some recognition. Like, I have developed a better sense of who I am and where I sit with these kinds of movements, or the plight of people who may not have the privilege that I do, and things of that sort. As you see ideas of empathy, that girl I mentioned earlier, not a girl who really had perspective taking, wasn't there, like was kind of stuck in her own insular bubble and wasn't thinking about like, gosh, this is what the rest of the world might look like. And so again, I am pleased that this is something that I think more and more students have greater awareness of, but it is something I always want to emphasize. Relationship skills. I always remind students that I had a dean of admissions who was my boss at the universities I worked at, and sitting over her and him was a vice president of enrollment, someone who was really a number cruncher, making sure everything kind of fit in terms of revenue and where students were coming from, and were they, enough people and enough majors. But at the same time, in many ways, my boss, it was the faculty, it was the professor, it was the people running laboratories, it was the people running theater programs, dance programs, film programs. It was the coaches of the various athletic teams on campus, because we were bringing people together. We weren't just we weren't just admitting kids, we were building a class. And it becomes so important on the admission side of things to kind of get that there are kids who can kind of, engage with each other in healthy ways. I'm reminded of a student I worked with a few years ago, who he was a very good student, very nice student. He did a lot of things on paper that seemed pretty exceptional, and he was applying to Stanford. And I was just kind of, well, not many people get into Stanford, even with all those things I talked about. I didn't quite see like what might take him to the next level. And he got in, and I was like, oh, okay, well, congratulations. That's awesome. But I was still a little surprised. I had a friend who worked there, so I reached out to her and I was like, hey, listen, off the record, I'd love to just understand a little bit better about how did, you accept 5% of the kids, 1 out of 20 kids. How did this kid meet the threshold? He's like, oh, she was like, Arun, the letters of recommendation from his counselors and his teachers were unlike anything, something we rarely see. And I was like, I'd love to know more. And she's like, well, it was all about the little moments, right? And I was like, well, little moment. And she shares the story that the counselor at the school talked about when at this, fairly affluent, image conscious, suburban LA school, upper middle class school, the first transgender student came. And this girl was sitting, first day at school, cafeteria. She knows no one, sitting by herself at a table. This student, very popular, had friends in a number, was an athlete, but also a science kid, class president. He sees her sitting by herself. Everyone is staring at this girl, right? They haven't really experienced this. And he stands up, picks up his tray, walks through the cafeteria, sits down, starts talking to her, stands up 5 minutes later, waves his buddies over who maybe they wanted to join, maybe they didn't, but they felt compelled to come cross over, and just integrated that girl into their friend circle, right? Like that kind of relationship building, kind of recognizing the world. It's a small thing, but it's one of those things that really stands out to a place like Stanford, who is trying to build this community of people who can kind of understand, build bridges, things of that sort. So these relationship skills, the kid, Caltech, we had an essay question, why do you like math or science? And we'd end up with a striking number of students who are like, I like math because I can do it by myself without anyone else bothering me. Yeah, that's not how Caltech students take their learning to the next level. It would be very easy to kind of knock that student out of our applicant pool. And finally, responsible decision making. I think I shared the Varsity Blues scandal earlier. That was an example of kids and parents not making very good decisions. But highlighted in here, I think this idea of reflecting ethical responsibility, this is something we're constantly pushing our students towards, developing a clearer sense of who you are and who you hope to become, and understanding the steps in between. College is going to be one of those steps. But as you make decisions, how does that impact who you are now and who you hope to become, right? And of course, there's all the ethics things and awareness and things of that sort. But again, colleges, being these like communities that want to be like healthy and safe spaces, they want kids who don't, who are able to make good decisions. And again, I'll come from the admissions side. It's always striking to folks when I talk about, it sounds kind of crazy, but there was a kid that we admitted at Caltech one year where his school, the counselor wrote, like, I regret to inform you, you admitted him early. He's been suspended because he got in a fight. And we were just like, okay, that's not good. This is a small campus. What's the fight? Turns out that the fight was because he has a brother who has developmental disabilities, challenges, and the kid was being bullied. And this kid stood up for his little brother, right? In the middle, apparently it was a joint campus, I remember. And he stood up and he fought. And it was like, oh, yeah, it wasn't the best idea to fight those kids, but you couldn't get mad at him the same way you'd get mad at the kid who was like, selling weed on campus, which is, by the way, something happens a lot, pops up in a lot of enough that you're like, that's poor decision making, right? But that fight in that particular context wasn't necessarily, it actually felt like a semi-noble thing to do. And that kid wrote like a letter explaining like, I've got to learn how to manage this better. But it was easy to kind of go, yeah, don't do it again. You still got your spot this fall. And again, another example, I mentioned the essays before. You'll see I pulled out, this is, you would see this in the UC prompts as well, by the way. But from a high, Cornell, highly regarded for their engineering programs, one of the finest engineering programs in the country. It's not just about like, I want to work at Google and here's why, because I'll make lots of money. They're like, use technology to make the world a better place. Harvard directly is like citizens and leaders, right? You've got that bottom phrase here, that last point we were talking about. So I was talking about self-reflection. You've got Childish Gambino prompt here. The thing I imagine myself being in the future doesn't exist yet. They're asking this high school student, and not all can do it, which means you might not be a great candidate for Dartmouth, but they're asking you, think it's not just about like getting into college, but like they're asking you to sit with and think about who you are now and who you hope to become down the road. And I want to highlight like a few resources here that I think, I'm just keeping my eye on the clock so we have time if there are questions or any chat. There's this organization, Challenge Success. Some of you may be familiar with. It comes a professor out of Stanford, Denise Pope, who really has taken a close look at what creates healthy students, high school students, how that translates into the admissions process, how they carry over into college. And this is something that I love to talk to students about. You know, before I even ask a new student I'm working with, how many AP classes are you taking? I'm asking them, how many hours of sleep do you get a night? Because I know inextricable, the most successful students that I work with in terms of the admissions process tend to be students who have kind of said, you know what, sleep's important. I got to make that part of my process. And then I'll build everything, you know, I've got my school hours, I've got my sleep hours, I'll build my extracurriculars, my demands of school around that, right? The students who are constantly looking like, well, I'll shave my like 8 hours of sleep down to 6 so I can take AP physics to impress Berkeley or LA. The wheels start coming off at that moment. And I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with Challenge Success's resources, take a peek, because there's a lot of great things, whether it's their free webinars, PDFs, things of that sort. Another organization I'm a big fan of that really is emphasizing the social emotional aspects of the admissions process. It's called the Making Caring Common Project out of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And they have put a huge emphasis on getting, talking about things like kindness and caring for each other. And we've seen a lot of, you know, again, I pointed out those essays, a lot of schools that have put an emphasis on, you know, pulling that out of students. Like, give us examples of where you care about, you know, more than just yourself. And so this is something from that, you know, what are they looking for? Meaningful, sustained community service. I mentioned earlier this idea, a lot of kids think of community service as hours. That's not what community service is not about the hours. It's about so much else. And Jacob, if you're still on, I don't know if you have to run, but if you could grab that podcast episode that I did with Kevin about community service not being just about the hours, I think folks might like directing some of their students who are thinking about, I want to do community service somewhere, I want to make an impact. I think it frames the idea of what great community service can look like. Again, this idea of collective, so working with others, community to impact, you know, this larger world around you. I talked about diversity. You know, it's not just, again, the hours. It's really doing work for people, with people rather than for. Let's not lose track of the fact that contributions to one's family are really important. You know, there were a lot of students at the start of the pandemic, in particular, where, you know what it meant? They showed social emotional strength by recognizing, you know what? Mom and dad are incredibly stressed with their jobs right now. I can pick up the laundry. Well, we can't go visit grandma and grandpa. I know how Zoom works. I'm going to teach them about that. You can do a lot with, you know, your immediate family in terms of showing these strengths. It's not all about extracurriculars and things that happen in the classroom. It's a lot of times just about what happens within a student's home. I want to emphasize the idea daily here, right? I talked about it's not about the hours, but there are those like kids, and there was the great example a few years ago where a student was admitted to a university, and the letter of recommendation was written by the school janitor. I think it was Lehigh University in Eastern Pennsylvania. And the school custodian wrote a letter of rec. And it was a little like, wait, what's this story about? And it was, you know, kid went to like this upper middle class high school, and the janitor talked about, I'm pretty much overlooked. No one thinks much about me because I'm just the janitor. But this is the one kid who every day is like, hey man, like, what was Thanksgiving like for you and your family? How are your kids doing? What are the plans for Christmas break coming up? That says something to, you know, that daily, just like, hey, how are you? He's the one student doing that. That is like daily awareness and contributing to others. It has nothing to do with like, I put in 25 hours at the Red Cross blood drive, right? That will have an impact on the admissions process. And then of course, it is not about the quantity of hours, it's about the quality. always pushing kids to dig in deeper rather than this idea of building a laundry list of things. And so I highlighted a resource from Making Caring. For any of you might have parents who are a little bit wound up. There's a lot of great resources here, and it really speaks to some of the anxiety for some parents, particularly in some communities. I think child of Asian parents. I know that, a lot of South Asian, East Asian communities, there'd be such pressure on like college. And there's some great resources there in the Making Caring Common project, like encouraging people, like if every dinner conversation is about college and getting into college, that's very different than saying, hey, what's the coolest thing you learned in school today? Right? You're emphasizing the wrong things with your child, right? And so instead of your kid thinking about school as like curiosity and, developing great relationships with their peers and their teachers and things of that sort, they're instead thinking about grades. Every time you go on a vacation, if it's about like pack your SAT flashcards, that's sending a certain message. So just a resource of mine that I think can encourage parents to get to some better behavior, because really there is plenty of room for this process to not be stressful. It absolutely can be one that is healthy. I think that I've got this to indicate a little bit of Zen, because I think there are a lot of kids who are like trophy chasing. They're going after brands, they're going after prestige, and that tends to ramp up the anxiety, right? And so one of the things, that I'm reminding students of is the students who fare best, they have a sense of why they're going to college. That Childish Gambino quote of like, who do you hope to become? Those kids who go to college, not because, well, in a lot of communities and cultures, there are those rites of passage that tell you're an adult. We don't necessarily have that in America as a country, right? And in some ways, the college admissions process has become that in a lot of ways. Well, you're 18 and you're not going to join the military and you don't want to get a job. I guess I'll go to college, right? Those kids who really think about, here's the role that college can play in my life. Here's what my 4-year experience can be. The ones who start thinking about that, even in the middle school years, not just like, I want to go to college, but really think about the person they want to be and college being a part of that. They do really well through high school. They do really well in the process, and they take advantage of college in a way that often leads to some pretty wonderful, personal and professional outcomes. And so, again, I'm being mindful of the clock here. I realize I don't have the chat box open, so I have no idea if there are even questions. But if you have questions, this would probably be a good time to start throwing them in there, or I'll just open the mic up and, you can kind of spit them out. But I'll share the last few slides. We're constantly this idea of fit, helping kids kind of understand finding the school that makes sense for them. We push back against ideas of ranking and prestige and reputation. For some kids, absolutely, it makes sense to stay in college within 2 hours of home. For other kids, the best idea in the world can be getting halfway across the country. Some students need really small, intimate environments. Other needs large ones that they can lose themselves in and meet new people, not just every day, but every hour. And so really digging in and kind of creating your own set of rankings to understand why these colleges are important also embraces the social emotional components. And again, this idea of a lot of kids are structuring their schedules every minute. I'll meet students where they're like, hey, can I talk to you about something? And they're like, oh, I have this 15-minute slot at 8:15 on Sunday night. And I'm like, what are you doing there? Well, I have this practice and I have this homework assignment. No, social scientists have done the hard work. Researchers in education have done the work. Most successful students are leaving themselves unconstructed time to explore their own interests. Just lay back and watch a little Netflix. There's nothing wrong with that, even for the most ambitious kid. That's often where some of the most creative things happen. There was one of the most fascinating things out of the pandemic. It's a podcast I listened to where, I wish I could remember which one it was, but it talked about in moments of like the pandemic, when the last one happened in 1918, the number of patents just completely dipped, because what happened was people were it was the pandemic and the 1918 flu, and when America went into prohibition. Basically, people stopped going out and socializing, or they stopped drinking together in bars. And what happened was all these great ideas, creativity that flows while sitting around around with fellow scientists at a bar or at a restaurant went away. And so the ideas went away. And students, I'm not going to encourage them to go drink at a bar, of course, but this idea of being able to get together with your friends and just hang out and talk is often just as valuable as one more hour of piano practice, or another hour on the soccer field, or whatever the case might be. And then last point here, encouraging kids to take some risks, right? There's admissions officers love that, but it's so important for growth, right? I have this up here because a lot of people don't know we actually have a train subway system here in LA. And here in LA, I can see a bright line between the kids who are not scared to get on the train and use public transportation to get around versus the ones who wait for mom and dad or their big brother to take them someplace. There's this funny bright line. The kid who's like, well, there's a cool art show happening across town and my mom and dad can't get me there because they're working, but I could hop on the bus and then transfer to the yellow line and it'll get me right to Little Tokyo. And then I've got like a half-mile walk and I'm at the museum. That's everything in social, the initiative, the motivation, the curiosity, that's everything wrapped up. So encouraging these students to take some risks has a lot of value. So you can tell it's something that I love talking about. I could spend a lot more time talking about it, but of course, all of you are working directly with students. And I know Rich has to drop some links on a survey and things of that sort, but I would love if any of you have questions or comments, I'll open up the chat box now. And if you've got like questions or comments, throw them in there, or just honestly, feel free to even I see this question here from Andrea, which I will tackle, but I also am totally fine. We've got a big group, but a small enough group where you can unmute yourself too. So Andrea's question, how do you think it is best to teach or promote these skills? It's a great question. Andrea, this is like a talk. There's like a student parent version of this that I will do at high schools. And it's interesting. The counselors will have me come in and do it because they're like, we talk about this, like in the classes, we've got posters that speak to this. We may even be a challenge success partner, blah, blah, blah. But it feels like it's the kind of thing that has to find its way into because again, we framed it through college admissions, but so many of these things are about just being healthy young people. I think hearing it in a billion different places and integrating it, I'm not sure you can get a chemistry teacher to speak about it the same way that I get excited talking about it. But given how important college is to a lot of the students, that's one way to talk about it. But my hope is that it's also something that is embraced, by your community service coordinator, who isn't just talking about like, get your hours, or it's, if you're a school that has a requirement for graduation. I think it will vary community. There are certainly, I'll speak at like, some of the public schools with limited resources in LA Unified. My conversation there is very different than when Malibu High School asked me to speak about this, right? So I do think you probably have a better sense of what your own community would find as a stronger approach. But I do hope it is something that you're able to bring up in the course of, as you talk about college, or if, your career center or something like that, you feel free to ping Jacob. And we've got lots of free resources as well at CollegeWise. I think I listed our social media stuff as well as our email addresses if you feel like you'd like some level of follow-up. But we've got tons of stuff that you as a professional can dive into. We've got a whole free 2-hour workshop on how to write letters of rec that speak to a lot of helping pull these things out as you write letters of rec, all free. And some of you may have students that you want to point, or parents you want to point towards some of the resources. Any other questions, comments?
Arun, do you want to talk about the Common App and Reach Higher webinars? I'm going to post the link right now.
Oh, yes. Oh, thanks, Jacob. That great point. So I mentioned earlier, we're partnered with the Common App and Reach Higher to celebrate the Excellence in College Counseling Award. We actually launched this 4-part series. We first talked about trauma and the teen 2 weeks ago. Last week, we spoke about it's not too late to apply, pointing out that while some, the UC's deadline was November 30th and Cal State's was around then, and a lot of private schools was January 1st, February 1st, the vast majority of colleges are continuing to take applications. Next week, we're going to be doing what's going to be an amazing workshop on affordability and how to think about financing colleges. This is all for counselors, by the way. So if you or any of your colleagues would like to attend any of this, I guess Jacob's dropping the link there. You can also find it on our social media, but you can register for that. They're free. And if you can't make it at the specific time, you will get a recording of it about 2 days afterwards. So please, I think some of you may already be familiar with CollegeWise and some of the things we do. Those of you who'd like to learn more, feel free to let me or Jacob know. Anything else, Jacob, that you feel like I should dig in? I know people would probably be happy to have their 5 minutes back too.
Yeah, I threw the link for the resources on our website. Just a plug for the podcast. There's webinars in there. There's the Common App guide that gets downloaded by hundreds, if not thousands of people. So there's a ton of resources there, and use it as best fits the students you serve.
Yeah. And actually since you guys, the 20 of you who are here, I can also tell you, because I just worked on this morning, we are going to do a spring webinar series where we'll be bringing in admissions officers who will speak to things like holistic admissions and things of that sort. We did a fall series where we had folks from like NYU and USC or UCLA and NYU talking about how the pandemic, how George Floyd, social justice, how those things can find their way into the application. Again, all social emotional stuff. And we're going to kickstart a new version of that in March. And again, you can follow us on social media. We post that. We post about a lot of that stuff as well for those of you who want to learn more or point your families towards that. So anyways, thank you. Like I said at the beginning, I saw you had a lot of very cool options. I'm pleased that you were interested enough to show up. I hope you actually found the content itself as interesting as the title and description that brought you here. And I wish you all the best of luck here in the coming weeks and months as we bring another strange year, academic year to a close. So anything else, Rich?
No, I just want to say thank you to Arun and Jacob. And you might have one more question with Mr. Soto. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Hello, Arun. I'll make this quick because I know we don't have that much time. And thank you.
Sure. I'm a fast talker, man. It's all good.
Yeah, I feel you. I'm right there with you. So I work at a school that about 70-80% of our kids are considered low income. And usually the small percentage of the kids that we do have applying to these UCs or these Common App universities are 4.0 kids and or higher, right? Those are kids that are heavy loading themselves in AP classes, and they know exactly what they have to do. And they might have interesting stories, but the question I have for you is regarding GPAs, right? Like there has to be a threshold for some of these kids that I know have great stories, like you're talking about, but their GPA, might not be that 4.0, might be a 3.4 or something like that. So my question to you is, when you hear some of these stories, what are some of the lowest GPA thresholds that you have seen in your experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, it's a great question. It's always going to be relative, right? Do kids with 2.5s get into Stanford? No. Maybe if you've got an amazing, sweet 3-point shot, or your, 40-yard dash time is amazing, right? Maybe a small, tiny number, right? But I will also say, and this is what's been the coolest thing with the data that we've seen over this year being test optional. Some of the kids that in past years where we're like, their story is amazing, but their test scores are kind of weak, they got into the schools that we felt they deserved to get into with the aid packages. Like we run a scholarship program. Oh, by the way, if you've got any students where you're like, this kid has no support at home, they could benefit from a one-on-one counseling experience, keep your eye out for our scholarship program. I think we'll be announcing it in March, and we take students, but the story matters. Now, the kid has to have a GPA, has to have course rigor and a GPA within the rough framework, So is a kid going to get into Berkeley with a 3.2? No. But normally a kid wouldn't get into Santa Cruz with a 3.2, but with a great story, they could. But that kid who has the 3.5, who typically wouldn't have sniffed Berkeley, who has a great story, absolutely would now, because that story might be what bridges the gap. So it's hard to say that like, hey, there are cutoffs, because there really aren't when we're talking about the holistic admissions process. But I do think by taking away the testing component, that deprogramming I talked about, it ends up adding just a little bit more emphasis on all these other pieces and parts, which is why I think the essays become even that much more important in a sense. Those of you who write letters of recommendation, they will continue to have a lot of impact. You know, I know a lot of counselors like, come on, man, do you really read them? Oh, heck yeah. Like that's the one part of the process that I always feel like, listen, you can hire a tutor to help you crush the SAT. You can have your English teacher work with you for 10 hours to write a killer personal statement. But the letter of rec from the counselor and the teachers, they're just spitting truth for the most part, right? So it's like, it's the real deal. And I think those stories do go a long way. But that's also where it becomes important about a kid finding the kid who needs that scholarship. Sometimes you get the reach schools, reach money. So when you apply to a school where you're like, I'm in the sweet spot, they admit students like me, that's where you're more likely to get the scholarship, right? And so that's also the other, or to get admitted with, a lot of money or things of that sort. So it is important to kind of keep that in mind as well. If you're admitted kind of like, we would like the story, but you're at the tail end of the admit pool, less likely to get scholarship money, things of that sort. So I think we're probably out of time. You need the link for the next session, right?
Yeah,
So.
we're out of time. And I think you had to have your Twitter handle and all of those great things. And Arun and Jacob, thank you so much for all the participants. Thank you as well. And, we look forward to you joining us at our next sessions, and much appreciated, Arun, as a parent.
Thanks for having us. It's cool to be able to present at this kind of county type thing. It's not a normal venue, but I love talking to counselors. And if any of you go to NACAC, any of the admissions conferences, hit me up. I'd love to. Jacob knows I love buying drinks, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Rich.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Take care, all.
All right.
Bye.